I'm Averie.
And I'm Mel.
This is the Veda Lounge Podcast.
All things Vedic, cosmic, and magic.
For yoga teachers, entrepreneurs, creatives, and coming back to your own center.
We explore themes on living like you practice to knowing your nature.
Join the conversation for an embodied homecoming to illuminate your radiance.
Through getting nerdy with Vedic sciences and self-discovery, cozy into your cosmic cadence.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Veda Lounge Podcast. It's Averie.
And Mel's here as well.
Today, we've got Gina here with us, and we're super excited to chat with her all things mindfulness with children. So Gina Hughes is a certified yoga instructor and an educator with over a decade of experience in public, charter, and homeschool settings. Trained in attachment parenting, she led a charter of Attachment Parenting International in the Chicago area, helping parents adopt respectful parenting practices. As a mom of two girls, Gina also owns Invitation Yoga and events where she specializes in private yoga experiences for individuals and groups. Today, we've got her here to share all of her insights on mindfulness with children, and we hope you enjoy. So welcome, Gina. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're super excited. Mel and I have actually talked a lot of mindfulness, children, mom stuff recently. So truthfully, it came at such a beautiful time for myself in particular. But
this is a topic I feel like with mindful parenting and co-regulating with kids, adapting to the unique nature of kids. My first question, just to kind of get the conversation rolling, is what brought you into, I know with education and working with parents, if you're open to sharing a little background on what got your journey going?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always knew from like a very young age that I wanted to teach in some capacity. I was really enjoyed working with kids. And so when I went to college, that's what I studied, was education. And then started my teaching career right away. Started in a charter school. I taught sixth graders primarily there, and then moved on to teach eighth grade. And then eventually stayed home to homeschool my kids. So I got a charter school setting, a public school setting, and then a homeschool setting with my kiddos. And then moved on from there to teach yoga. But what was interesting is just like the common threads from what I learned from a respectful parent myself. I did a lot of training, like Averie mentioned, with Attachment Parenting International to lead a group of moms. I learned about, what respectful parenting looks like, and had the opportunity to try that out myself. And then as I got into the yoga world, it was really interesting because a lot of the yogic philosophy is really heavily aligned with those respectful parenting practices that I had been helping other parents with and learning at the same time myself for years and years. So it was just really beautiful sort of how it all lined up.
What is respectful parenting? I'd love, tell us.
No, that's it. That's a great question. So when you look at the science of parenting and the studies and everything, typically you're going to see, these three different types of parenting, right? The authoritarian, which is very much like reward and punishment, like control, right? And then you have the permissive parents, which are usually like the big softies. And then you have the authoritative, which are in between. And that's typically where the respectful parents lie. So rather than going after control of the child, or rather than feeling like the relationship is fragile in some capacity, which is often what we see with more permissive parenting styles, like they're afraid, if I hold this boundary, my kid's gonna hate me forever, right? We see some of that. That this respectful parenting model works primarily on collaboration with the child as they get older, and when they're young, it's holding boundaries with respect. Like when you set a boundary, it is what it is, and you follow through. But you don't have to do rewards and punishments. Like there's another way. It's really interesting.
That is so interesting. I feel like there's so many, like becoming a parent and trying to get all the information so you do it right and you don't mess up, or like the fear of messing up our kids, right? Like I think this is something that every parent is trying to swim through, and the challenge with all of our kids being so unique. What I like about this concept though is how are we operating in relationship to that uniqueness? And I don't know if you have had any experiences where there was just like really big aha moments when you were learning some of this stuff that maybe you can share that our listeners would appreciate.
Yeah, for sure. I think concrete examples are super, super helpful. So I want to give an example of like going to the park with your kid, but then your kid will not leave the park. So this is just like a very common one when kids are like, 3, 4 years old, right? And I feel like this was just like a simple thing for me when understanding like, how do I hold a boundary respectfully? Like, what does that even look like? So if you can imagine you're having a great time at the park with your 4-year-old, everything's going great, but you have a deadline, like you have to go home, you have to cook dinner, the time is coming to an end. And of course, parents will do all of the things. They will say, 3 minutes left, or like even pick, kids have no concept of time. So there's issues with that. Or they'll say like, even pick 2 more things. Last thing, pick your last thing. It's time to go. But inevitably there is going to be a time where it is time to go. You've given all the warnings. You've given them the opportunity to finish up what they're working on. And the answer from your child is still going to be that they're not leaving. And so if we think about it from a parenting perspective where the parent might be punitive, then you're going to see either a bribe or a punishment, right? Like if you come home right now with me, like we'll get ice cream on the way. Or if you don't get over here right now, you're going to go straight to your room for 15 minutes when you get home, or I'm never bringing you to the park again, right? We see that. Or a permissive parent might be like, okay, well, I guess we just live here now. Like, we're just going to hang here for as long as you want. I guess we don't need to eat dinner ever. For me, because I've had this experience, right? And the respectful parenting answer when they're young, obviously this gets trickier as they age, but then the problems are different as they age, or the situations are different. But you can say, it's time to leave. You physically pick up the child if they're not coming with you, and you bring them to the car. And that's it. I mean, you don't have to yell, you don't have to scream, you don't have to threaten, you don't have to stay there forever. You just gently pick them up and go. And they might be kicking and screaming. They might be throwing a huge fit, but it's really not about what the child is doing at that point. It's how is the parent staying regulated in that moment? And when we can show as parents that, we're exuding this confidence. If you have the child, and I know, and you can empathize in that moment, you really don't want to leave the park. I hear you. You're making that loud and clear, right? But when we can show that we can stay regulated, we are exuding confidence to our child of, hey, I can handle whatever big feelings you're throwing at me. I've got this. And that'll lead to that secure attachment where it's like a bridge with guardrails, right? Like there's safety rails where the kids feel safe because they know that we can handle whatever's happening internally in them.
This feels like a metaphor for yoga.
Yeah, right? There's so much overlap. Yeah.
I like that you talk about the concept of picking them up physically. And so I've heard a lot, right, about how we often ask a lot of our children and we're like, hey, it's time to go. Let's go, let's go, let's go. Instead of just like doing the easy thing and guiding them and going and getting their hand and being like, now it's time to walk out the front door and we're going to do it together. And it's this really funny thing to me where it's the easiest, it's often the easiest option. You don't have to think of a bribe. You don't have to think of a punishment. You just have to go physically be in it with them. But that's scary sometimes to people to be like, oh, for me personally, like if I have a kid kicking and screaming and yelling, I'm like, oh, I'm overstimulated. Now my nervous system is starting to shriek. And so what would you say, right, to a parent when you're in that moment, but we're trying to help our child regulate, but now we are not regulated either because it's really easy to think about these things, I think, in hindsight sometimes, or after the fact, after we weren't regulated. So maybe some tips for parents who are like in the thick of it, where you're like, yo, I'm not regulated. I'm trying to respectful parent you, but I'm so into myself that it's tough.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So I think a couple things. So I definitely want to get into, if it is real bad and they're kicking and screaming, like what do you do as a parent? But also before that, I want to mention that like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say, right? And so if we can, as parents, if we can catch it and really pay attention to the child's cues early enough, you may not even have to get to that point. So we all know that kids like to be lighthearted and silly and fun. So if you catch them at a time when they'll tolerate it, you can maybe just hold their hand and say, "Hey, it's time to go to the car. Should we?" And then provide a limited choice. Should we skip or should we hop like a bunny? And you make it silly and you make it fun, and then they go with you and they play into your game. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. The other thing, and unfortunately, I don't remember which parenting book I read this in, but there's an acronym called HALT, so HALT, and it stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And the concept behind this is if your child, or frankly, like anybody, has two or more of those things going on at the same time, just prepare yourself for a huge meltdown. So if you ask them, if they're at the park, they haven't eaten in like 3.5 hours because you've been there forever, and they've been running around playing tag and they're exhausted, you're probably going to get a meltdown. So how do we prevent that and how do we generate more cooperation? Maybe stay at the park for a little less time, or make sure that they are resting in between so they're not like completely wiped. Pack lots of snacks. And in terms of lonely, like play with them or make sure that they have someone else that they're like doing something with, right? So sometimes if we can kind of get ahead of some of those behaviors, they're more likely to cooperate in terms of leaving anyway. But there are still going to be times, and I've experienced plenty of them, where you've done all the things and it doesn't matter and they're still freaking out. And I would say initially controlling your own breath, and this goes back to yoga, right? We know that as we lengthen the exhale, that tells our body that it's okay to calm down. Our parasympathetic nervous system is starting to kick into gear. So if you're able to focus on your own breath, even as your child is yelling, I think that's super helpful. Honestly, there are plenty of earplugs on the market. This sounds so funny, but for real, there are plenty of earplugs on the market where you can hear your kid. Like, you're not blocking them out, you can hear them, but it just takes the edge off. So if you're like a sensory person, like that's me. When I have so sensory overload, that's when I get snappy. So I use those, I think they're called like loops or something, but they're these earplugs that just like dull it a little bit. And then I can respond more with kindness. Super, super helpful. And the other thing is, in the respectful parenting community, most often you will hear that timeout is like a no-go, like putting the kids in isolation, because then you're not teaching them what to do with their feelings. You're not like supporting them through it. But I'm a big proponent of parents being able to take a timeout if they need to for themselves, right? So if you drive your kid home from the park, you're 10 minutes away, most people can breathe through 5 or 10 minutes of upset from their kid. At that point, if your kid is still going, you as a parent might need to say, "Hey, I love you. I'm going to take a minute. I'm going to go into the room. I'm going to step into the backyard," whatever. And then get a little bit of space for you, even if it's just for 5 minutes, so that you can re-enter that situation with your child from a regulated state.
This is beautiful, when especially talking about the self-awareness of ourselves as parents, because I want to share just like briefly, one of my mentors said to me, she said, people don't realize that everything can be recognized as a spiritual path. And in life, either you go straight to God, you become a monk, you give up chai lattes, you just go to the monastery. You could become an expert in something and master a craft, and that's your dharma, that's your path in life. Or you choose family and children. And that family and children it's a spiritual teaching, it's a dharma. And I remember when she said this to me, I said, well, do you get to choose? And she said, well, a lot of times life unfolds. I said, yeah, I was married at 19. Like, I don't remember going, okay, which out of the three do I want to choose? And I was like, that's kind of not fair. And she's like, no, it's what our souls. And she said, the hardest spiritual path is parenthood, marriage and child. Like, that is the deepest spiritual path. We think it's going straight to God to become a monk and, you know, whatever those things are. But it really, because you're in such of the muck of it. And I think that because children are such mirrors, you know, I think about whether it's literally pregnancy to the delivery process to the phases of development as they are growing. It is different versions of basic training for our own souls as parents. And I'm assuming dads probably feel very similar. But as a mother, it's like every new chapter with my daughter is a new learning about myself. And,
Yes.
and like we give ourselves permission to really look at how we're responding and how we are relating to our children and how it's growing us compared to trying to control the child, right? It's such a different way of thinking.
Yes, absolutely. In that growth and in the mirror that our child shows us, I think there's so much fear involved, like behind parenting. And I don't feel like any parent, whether they're authoritarian or permissive or whatever style, everybody desires to be a good parent. But when you have the authoritarian parent, there's so much fear around losing control, which I think is really interesting, like from a yogic perspective of like holding on and grasping and I gotta fix this, I gotta hold on to this, I know best, I'm older. And how do we release that? And how do we develop trust in that relationship between us and our kids? And then likewise, like I mentioned a little bit before, that permissive parent, there's so much fear around losing that relationship with the child that it's so fragile. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I do the wrong thing? What if they shut me out? And so that's one thing that I think is so beautiful about respectful parenting is there's this level of trust, this level of collaboration. Particularly, you set those boundaries and you hold them when they're young and they trust you. That builds trust. That when you say it's time to go home from the park and you actually, because you pick them up and that creates trust. Because when you say something, you mean it. And you mean it with kindness, but you mean it. And then as the child grows and gets older, it develops so much more into this collaborative conversation when there's problems. So Ross Greene is a really interesting author. He wrote a book called The Explosive Child, which is like a really intense title. But I read it when my daughter was 4 or 5 because she was an explosive child. I mean, she really, really was. But she's not anymore. That she's 10. She's lovely. But the whole premise behind his book is around collaborative problem solving. And people don't think you can do it with kids that are young, but you absolutely can. Because when you really slow down and you take the time to hear out your child, to let them talk, to communicate, like really what is the issue? Oftentimes there's a really simple solution. If we just go back to the park example, there might be a time when your kid says, no, I can't, I'm not going to leave. And if you slow down to ask them, well, what's up? Why not? Maybe they say, I haven't tried out that one slide yet. I just want to do that one thing. And then you're like, oh, okay, we'll just do that. And then we'll go. Whereas if you don't take the time to talk with them, then you get into this power struggle.
I love this, especially connecting it to a parigraha, right? In yoga with that holding on and that grasping. But this is also when we read and learn from the Bhagavad Gita or a lot of other yoga philosophy around suffering and how suffering is a byproduct of our attachments and our resistance, right? And how that can play out so unconsciously in our parenting.
Yes. And how many times have we done something like gone on a fun family outing? Everyone will have a fun time. This is going to be the best time ever. And you put those expectations on, and that's what causes the suffering when it doesn't align with what's in your mind, right? Yeah, I think it definitely shows up in parenting for sure.
I'm super interested. We've talked a lot about respectful parenting, and now in your work with yoga and, mindfulness with children, a lot of it probably is similar, right? Because like you said, the principles between a lot of yogic philosophy and the teachings of respectful parenting are the same. But what are some ways where you've kind of been able to shift this into, what you've learned through your yoga practice and through your yoga business, in being able to apply mindfulness techniques with kids? Because I am someone who, right, I have an explosive 5-year-old old, and being able to cool down, I'm constantly looking for ways. So if you could share some practices that you use and that you have found have just really been beneficial, I think everyone would love that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the opportunity to work quite a bit with kids in the yogic world, which has been really fun, and with some parents and teachers too. So I think when we think about self-regulation, it's a skill. It's a skill that children need to develop. And I think so much as adults, we expect children to be born being able to self-regulate, and they literally cannot. So there's this New York Times bestselling author. She goes by Dr. Becky. She wrote a book called The Good Inside. And I saw on one of her social media platforms recently that she was talking about if you took your kid to the swimming pool and they didn't know how to swim, and you threw them in the pool and they were having a really hard time, they were flailing around and like they just could not get it, no matter how hard, you were there with them in the pool and they couldn't get it. There's no parent on the face of this earth who would bring their child home, punish them, and say, you're going to sit there in your bedroom until you figure out how to swim. Like it doesn't make any sense. And her point is it's the same for emotional regulation and self-regulation. That so often parents will say, just go in your own separate space until you figure out how to behave. But they need actual skills for how to do that. One strategy that I was taught by a parenting expert that was hugely influential to me was a grounding practice that it's called 5-4-3-2-1. So, and I did this with my daughter when she was 2 or 3 years old. And it just, the point of it is to get them out of the swirling feelings and back into the body. So you ask the child to find 5 things that they see in their space right in this moment, and they can tell you. And then they tell you 4 things that they can hear. So they have to pause and listen, get real quiet. And then they find 3 things that they can feel, either on their body, like their clothes, or maybe something next to them. And then you have them find 2 things they can smell, or their favorite smells. So they might imagine here, like, oh, I love, chocolate chip cookies fresh out of the oven. It doesn't matter if it's not real. They're still like thinking about it. And then 1 thing they can taste, or their favorite taste. And so what that does then is it brings them out of the tantrum and back into the present moment. Now, when parents say this does not work is when they're at the height of it. So if you picture like a surfer on a wave, right? Like a big wave. So if you're a surfer, they talk about riding the wave. I'm not a surfer, but so you can sneak onto that wave right before it gets really big, or you can get on it like after it crests, like at the bottom, right? And this strategy and really many of these emotional regulation strategies are the same. Like if you try to get your kid to do that with you and they are like screaming and flailing, they are not hearing you at that moment. But if you can catch it a little bit before or a little bit after, it's really powerful. My daughter at an extremely young age would ask for that strategy. She would ask me to guide her through it. And that was really, really powerful for her. Another thing that you can do with kids is you can make breath work really accessible. There's a lot of different like silly breathing strategies. And again, as always, like practicing these with kids in moments of calm so they can access them later. So this is one thing that I'm doing right now. I do work with teenagers as well. And when I explain this to teenagers and why we're doing these breathwork strategies and things when they're like not even upset, is that like if you can picture yourself walking through a forest during the daytime and then you see like a path off to the side that like sort of has some footprints, but you can tell that that's like not really a path yet. that you can find it okay during the day if you want to take that path. But at night, it's harder to find it until you've walked it a million times. And I talked to them about that. Like, that's what we're doing as we're building these neural pathways, these new patterns. We have to practice it over and over again when it's light outside, when things are okay, so that when we're in the dark and we're in the thick of it, we can find that path again and it's well worn. Just a couple of examples of strategies. If you're talking like really, really young kids, you can even incorporate it into songs and games. So one thing I teach kids is you can turn your 5 fingers into candles, and you can pretend you can use your thumb to like put a little light on each of your fingers. And then you take a big breath in and you blow out your candle nice and slow. And you just repeat that. And maybe at the end, you want to just be silly and go and, make it fast because they're kids and they like to be fun. Or you can, especially in the fall, you can have them rub their hands together and then think about like their favorite warm or hot food. And you can have them close their eyes and put it in their hand, take a big breath in, smell the food, and big breath out, cool it off. So just little like silly things like that to get them practicing breath work is a really powerful tool, and just kind of make it fun and silly.
This is so awesome. I actually used to with my daughter, like we would talk about things or like ideas and share, because she would also have ideas and make up stuff. Obviously, this is not when she's upset, right? Like we just have conversations. And I remember the first time, like I was upset about something, and she came over and she said, "Hey, do you remember?" And I really can't remember what the activity was, but she said, "Mommy, you should do that too." And she offered it to me. And I realized what was happening pretty quick, like, oh my gosh, this is actually a great opportunity. And I said, thank you so much. So I had her guide me. And then that actually became a thing where, like, if she was upset and she was so open to me guiding her through things or doing things, and then switching it, like when I was upset, like I would always welcome her in. I would never shut her down, even if I was like, because I realized how that, going back to that trust. But now she's big on like, she talks and teaches about this stuff. And I think my daughter has like a very like, she's a very matter of fact, and she's gonna, it's kind of her personality. So even thinking about like the uniqueness of their personalities, of how they would relate to this stuff. But oh, I love this. So good.
Yes. And that's so sweet that she does that. And one more thing that's really easy to do too is any activities with kids that cross the midline. So if you imagine like a vertical line cutting your body in half. So when kids are dysregulated, when anybody's dysregulated, the different parts of the brain aren't doing a very good job talking to each other anymore. And so any activity where you're crossing one part of the body onto the opposite side helps to reintegrate those different parts of the brain so they start talking to each other again, which can bring a kid out of a tantrum. Again, when they're like at the bottom of that wave or coming out of it. Otherwise, you just kind of have to ride it. But you can do this with, you can turn it into a game. Simon says, cross your arms, give yourself a hug. Simon says, touch your foot, but go to the opposite side, right? Or you can do like windshield wiper arms and swish side to side like that and kind of tap your body. That also gives different sensory input, which is kind of nice. So that would be another thing. And just paying attention to that hungry, angry, lonely, tired, right? Like trying to get ahead of it. It's that's a game changer for sure.
I like that you mentioned like how, with the sensory stuff and the movement, because what some kids need, I'm sure and have experienced with 2 different children, what one needs is often probably very, very different from what the other needs. And so it's so interesting to me, right? I have a very sensory seeking kid. So I love this, right? Where it's like, okay, she craves the movement. She's fire. She needs to move to feel regulated. Where we've done stuff that's more like sedentary in the past, and I can see her like physically crawling to try and get out. So it's knowing too. I think it's really beautiful that it's like, just because it works with one doesn't mean it's going to work with all. It's, the same reason why we have, teachers who try their hardest to teach every kid differently. And,
100%. My 2 girls are very vastly different. And my older one is very sensory seeking as well, and was even more so when she was young. When you have a sensory seeking kid, we as parents tend to see a lot of what we would deem to be like misbehavior, right? It's like,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, my kid is like climbing on the counter, my kid is jumping on the couch, my kid is like hanging off the ceiling. And so part of the challenge as parents is how can we create an appropriate outlet for like what is the need and how do we create an appropriate outlet for that need? And so much of that is knowing your kid and communicating with your kid. So if you got a kid who's bouncing on your couch and you really don't, that's a no in your house, where can they bounce appropriately, right? Like, do you have a mini trampoline in your house? Do you have a jump rope that they can take out back? Like, they're clearly seeking that jumping input. Do you have a big pillow that you can put on the ground? Like, how can they? And that's too where a kid can problem solve and brainstorm with you. Oh, you really want to jump right now? Okay, well, I'm not going to let you jump on the couch. Pick up child. Let's take their hand. What else can we jump on? Let's go find it. Can you help me find it? Let's go on a scavenger hunt. Could we jump on this? And you can be silly, like, here are mommy's shoes. Could we jump on that? Could we jump on this teddy bear? Could we jump on, and then you make it a game, right?
It's interesting that you say a lot of it gets when you do have very sensory seeking kids, because the truth is I think a lot of kids are very sensory seeking, but I don't think that we really facilitate those environments for them, especially at home and even in schools, unfortunately. But I love, right, that it's like, again, it's the collaborative effort of you recognizing a pattern going, hey, wow, my kid really stomps all day. My kid is stomping on the ground. I can't stand it when they stomp in my house. My floors, I live on a like raised up platform. So
Yeah.
then it's going, well, clearly they need to stomp, and then going outside to stomp. But it's like, again, it's the simplest things, the simplest fixes often, but we get so stuck in these patterns of, well, don't stomp on the floor because it's bothering me, right? Rather than, again, I love this collaborative effort of, well, clearly this is what you need right now. Your body is seeking this. My body is seeking to not be jazzed out because I hear you hanging on the floor. So let's find something that works for both.
You said something really interesting and it reminded me. So, in the yogic adjacent world, when we talk about like manifestation, we talk about how like the universe doesn't understand like no or not, right? Like we want to phrase things like what we want. And kids speak the language of the universe, right? And so that we know that when we say like, no, don't do that, or like, no, stop, they literally filter out that no. So also keeping in mind like our languaging and how do we phrase things positively rather than like, no, stop jumping on the couch. It's, wow, your body really needs to jump. Let's jump outside.
It's definitely this mirror to, thinking about how we are so attached to that yes, no mentality versus learning how to collaborate. This is oftentimes in yoga, and we see this with students, whether they're on a journey or getting started in their practice, that it's just so odd to be offered options and that they are safe to choose. And so, I think part of what has structured this yes no even in parenting is just how culturally it is countercultural to be able to negotiate, to adapt, to make it ours. And through our parenting, there may be an opportunity for reclaiming that in many ways within ourselves too, like when you look at it from this perspective.
Yeah, and I think people are afraid to collaborate with their kids. I mean, truly, honestly, you'll see jokes like flying around the internet, especially talking about toddlers, like I don't negotiate with terrorists, right? You see those things and it's like, you can kind of laugh at it, but even kids who are very young respond well to limited choice. Like you're not going to want to give them the world of options. But if they're fighting you on getting dressed in the morning, then and they want to wear something like, I don't know, their dinosaur costume that you can't fit them in the car seat, so like you can't. It's okay. Do you want to wear this princess dress today, or do you want to wear these pants, or whatever? And giving them that limited choice is a way to collaborate with them when they're very young. As they get older, it's the same thing. I mean, I think there's this mindset of like, well, I'm the parent, so like I know better. But the reality is we often don't. Like kids, especially when they go to a public school setting, they're away from us for a lot of the day. And we don't always know. I mean, we might be able to relate to what we think is happening from our own experiences, but it isn't their reality. And that's why we hear kids so often tell their parents, you don't get it, because the parents are doing more talking than listening. And so I think, as parents are maybe they're hearing their child talk through a problem and they're feeling concerned. A really powerful phrase as kids get older and you're trying to collaborate or trying to guide them is, what's your plan?
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds so and it's not meant to be like a brush off, but it really is something where, then it gives them the opportunity to say, what is my plan? I'm going to think through, maybe I do this, maybe I do this. And at that point, the older child or teenager might say, well, what do you think? And there's your opening. But if you come in guns blazing of like, do this and why haven't you thought of this, then you're not cultivating that pause. There's no opportunity for the child to solve their own problems. And then we have kids who grow up and don't know how to solve their own problems, and we wonder why.
What I love is it's, whether it's the limited choices when they're young or getting older and allowing them that self-agency to choose how they're going to work through their problem. But that's exactly what it's building. And I don't think it's natural, like you said, for parents to be like, well, you choose. And I think a lot of it comes from the fear of us as their parents. Well, they're going to choose wrong, and that's reflected upon me. And that's the biggest thing where I think we're so scared to get it wrong. We're so scared for them to get it wrong, not because they're going to get it wrong, but ultimately it's the subconscious process of like, how does that reflect upon me as a parent and the job that I'm doing? And so maybe learning to let go a little bit of that, because again, that's attachment to outcome, right? Because we see this, well, however my kid turns out, the decisions that they make, that's on me. And that in turn, I think like robs them of their own journey in a sense, right? And being able to build this sense of self-agency and who they are.
And
So
it robs them of the opportunity to fail.
Mm.
So talk about yoga and postures, and we fall out of a posture. It's like, okay, it's just like life. You fall out. How are you going to get back in? How are you going to get back on that proverbial horse? And I think if we're always coming in and telling kids how to solve their problems or rescuing our kids from whatever their problem is, we talk so much about grit, right? That was like the buzzword a few years ago, especially in the education world, like grit and resilience. If kids never have the opportunity to fail, how are they supposed to build grit and resilience to try again? Because they literally have never had that experience. And then these kids go to college, or maybe they get fired from their first job, and it feels like the end of the world because they haven't been able to experience that in a smaller way, so that when it happens in a big way, it feels very catastrophic. Yeah.
That is so big and so true. And I think back to is just, I know culturally things are changing, which is exciting, I think, for generations to come. But there was so much pressure on the over identification with failure or not making good grades. So if you didn't make a good grade, that means you're not smart. If you didn't finish, you didn't turn it in on time, that means you're irresponsible. And there was just such a rigidity around identification with these experiences versus normalizing that, okay, mistakes are made and you're amazing. You didn't make a great grade and there's opportunities to try again.
And our testing culture is huge. I mean, even my younger daughter is in first grade, and she deals with, I don't know what else to call it besides test anxiety. I mean, she really does have it. I come from a background of well-meaning parents who really had very high expectations for the best, the best, the best. So it's rewriting that script in my head for how can we take a child with test anxiety and help them understand what is a test? What is the purpose of a test? It's to understand where you need a little extra support. Like, where do you need help? Where do you need to try again? Where do you need to develop those skills? It doesn't say that you're not smart or that you're bad at something. It's information for the teacher really about how does that educator need to help you? Because we're coming from, just from my own background in education, like there are plenty of teachers that will teach a topic and then kids fail on the test and they're like, well, I don't know about these kids. I taught it. I taught it.
Yeah.
But that's not, I mean, literally the purpose of the test should be to inform instruction. Where does that teacher need to go back and try again? And so just kind of framing that way for our kids of like, all this test is showing us, if it doesn't go well, is where you have room to grow.
Mhm.
And that's not bad. It's just, it's information.
I was gonna say when you're talking about this, and I don't know, it like does something to my nervous system just because in school it's very much like if you did not make a good grade, then there's something wrong with you versus like I've never heard someone just frame it the way you did just now, and it's like duh, it's just a temperature check. Where because I oppose tests, and y'all, anybody who's trained with me knows I don't make y'all the way we do it is different for process, because I know from my own experience, and I see this in a lot of arenas where people are just doing things to get to the result. I'm gonna focus on this just so I can get to that test, and they're not actually in relationship with the substance and the content they're learning. And I feel like our school systems have really lost that because they present this as, if you don't make this grade or get this good whatever, then there's something wrong with you. And I think my generation and a lot of generations, honestly, but just recent conversations, it's like because of that over identification to those outcomes, as adults, we're paralyzed of our identity if we didn't achieve, right? How does it actually set us up for success and adaption? I could go
I
on.
mean, the achievement culture is real. It's extremely stressful. And then you get people as they're adults who work themselves to death and experience burnout. Yeah, the testing stuff, honestly, is it's stressful for me too.
I have a kindergartner. I'm brand new to the school system and I am so stressed. I'm like, what is like I didn't know. I wish I was warned. But like it is. So any kindergarten moms out there, I feel for you just getting the hang of it. But really it's a lot. I mean, it's been interesting to watch, and without sharing too much, because, protecting and honoring who she is in her own journey, she comes home very stressed out.
Mhm.
And, as a mom, I'm like, oh, we got to figure some stuff out, right? We need to, because it's hard to watch, right? A 5-year-old stressed out about school, when I'm like, I grapple with this. Oh, but like, this is still your time to be a kid, right? This is still your time to be a child. You're learning how to work in the real world. You shouldn't be so stressed out in kindergarten, right? So I love that some of these, right, stress management techniques that can be used with kids, because anybody who's navigating, like, I feel for you, and it's hard to watch your kids struggle and be stressed. And I think a lot of what that testing does is it's really stressful. Yeah.
I think, yes, 100% yes to all that. And I think when we, so on the mat in yoga, when we talk about, postures, when we talk about getting into a pose, a lot of times, teachers will talk about breathing through discomfort. That discomfort is okay, but you should never feel like pain, right? And I think that we can apply that to kids in the school systems as well, as they're bringing home all this homework. Like, it's okay to feel a little bit of discomfort. Like, nobody loves to do their homework usually, but like we can do hard things, like we can get through it. And also, there have been times, and I'm thinking primarily for my older one, so she's in 5th grade now, but there have been times really for both of them where they've come home and you can tell that there is pain there. It is not just like, I don't feel like this today. I don't, but they're like, oh, this happened and this happened and this happened, and I just cannot. And then I think at that point, it's important as parents to demonstrate for our kids to advocate for themselves. And if they're very young, that we can advocate for them too, and show them what that process looks like. I'm not shy about emailing the teacher and saying, hey, my kid had a really rough day. Here's some things that are going on. I need her to just chill this afternoon. We'll get this to you. We will do the assignment and we'll do it promptly, but it isn't going to be tonight. And I don't do it often, but I have done it a handful of times. And every single time I'm always met with understanding. And I think the reason is because the rest of the time, there's responsibility that's taught and they're following through and all that. So then you can show your kids like, this is feeling too much, honor that. Advocate for yourself, tell them, I will do this, not right now, and take that break that you need.
I love, but it's so interesting, right? Because I think it's really big in yoga how, I mean, when I teach, I literally tell my students, if you want to take an hour-long nap, be my guest. Love that for you. But then when we come to applying that, right, as parents, but again, it's so attached, I think, and entwined with our own identity and our own values sometimes that it's like you forget that you can be like, hey, yeah, just take a break. Take it easy. I'll go run you a nice bubble bath. Again, it's the easiest option oftentimes. But so I love that. And reminding them too that they can just take a break.
Yes. And knowing that sometimes if we slow down, then we're more ready to ramp it up later. It's like like in a yoga practice where it starts out slow, right? And then builds, right? And then comes back down. Like we can give our kids a break. It's okay. And then they'll be filled up and ready to ramp it up a little bit later, you know?
I would say too that mindful parenting really is a piece of modeling. Like, do we give ourselves a break? Are we modeling? Like, do I advocate for myself? It's so funny because they watch so closely what we're doing. And you know, again, my daughter is very direct, and she'll tell you that like she won't hold back talking about how her mom is and how mom doesn't like to stand in lines, and mom is you know, like affirmations and funny things that we say around the house. She'll mirror it back to me. And it's really powerful though, because what I realize, especially, I mean, now she's moving into a little older in elementary school, but she, like the things, I didn't tell her to necessarily do something, but it's so normalized because it's modeled. But also, on the other side is that unhealthy or negative thinking or different beliefs, like that can get modeled too. And I think our kids in a way are such powerful mirrors. And the more that we focus on our own permission for vitality, permission for rest, you know, honesty, being honest, like that's one of the biggest things that I have found. Not that I'm a perfect parent by any means, but I really love this topic of mindful parenting because I think part of it is mindfulness is about paying attention on purpose without reactivity, right? So being present, I'm paying attention right now. And right now, my heart's broken and I'm struggling with this. And right now my heart is excited and this is, you know, whatever. But that honesty and not putting on a show all the time or that achievement or that performance, but like really connecting heart to heart so she can see how I navigate. And even with my husband, like we have these open conversations a lot with what he's modeling to her and what I'm modeling. So yeah, it's paying attention to those things.
And what you just described is satya from a parenting perspective, right? It's how it's how can we be, I mean, obviously we don't want to put anything too heavy on our kids, but kids know what's up. And if you're, you know, it's healthy to model, to be honest about how you're feeling in the moment and labeling those feelings, right? How are they going to become good at understanding their own emotions other than by watching you understand yours? I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling stressed out right now. I'm feeling so excited, you know, whatever it is. I think being honest about that, right? And it's not their responsibility. It's not their fault. This is just what's happening. Yeah, it's satya.
I love how you tied the 8 limbs of yoga into parenting. Is there anything else that you want to add with the 8 limbs that you think might be really helpful, or the yamas and niyamas in yoga?
You know, I think when we talk about nonviolence, ahimsa, and we touched upon this a little bit as we were talking about, like giving kids the opportunity to solve their own problems. But one thing in Deborah Adele's book, Yamas and Niyamas, she talks about violence being like having the attitude that we know better than the person who's experiencing the problem.
Mm.
And I feel like when we're parenting, particularly into the preteen, teenage years, it is so easy to get there. I know better. I'll just tell you what to do. That's actually like violent towards the child, right? It's robbing them of that experience to problem solve. So I think that's kind of an interesting perspective. I think when we think about respectful parenting, gentle parenting, we just think like gentle hands, right?
Mm.
And it's so much more than that. It's gentle hearts too. More about Satya and truthfulness. Like when we get into, it's really interesting to look at like why kids lie or why adults lie. And a lot of times parents will get so upset because they're like, oh, we always want to tell the truth in our household. You have to tell the truth. And their kids lie. And the parents wonder, like, why? Like, that's not okay. And then they punish that lie. And a lot of times when we look at what's happening in the family systems when that's occurring, is that the child is afraid of punishment for the truth. And so it's cultivating, again, that spirit of collaboration, of non-judgment, of listening to your child, that's going to allow them to continue to be truthful with you. Because if every time your child comes to you with something bad that happened, be it they accidentally smashed your favorite vase by knocking it off the table, or they got a bad grade at school. And if we approach with a punitive mindset over a mindset of curiosity, all that's going to do is encourage the child to become sneakier in the future. And I think that that's something that's really powerful to remember, especially as kids get bigger.
What's so interesting to me, right, is a lot of us become parents and we haven't done extensive research, right? Unless you're in education, unless you have this powerful background. But I think a lot of us are thrust into it and we're like, whoa, all we have is this set of schemes and stories of how it was done when we were raised. And it's so interesting, right, to watch new ways kind of come on board and for parents in today's generation to start to kind of shatter a lot of these old mindsets. But it's so interesting. Like I call it, I have a name for it, and I call it, when my kid is doing something and I revert back to like something and I'm like, wait, that's like not how I want to handle that. That is not. And it's 9 times out of 10, it's because it was how it was handled when I was a child. And so it's really interesting. I call it shark music, right? Because it's like, we don't know where that comes from, but it comes from the past. So it's like, dun, dun, dun. And it's like, whoa, where is that? That's just your shark music playing. And so it's interesting as a parent, right? Because then when we hold this, like the power of self-awareness is to go, oh, wow, well, I'm choosing differently. Again, with like the yogic perspective, right? I'm choosing different in this moment because I know, right, that there's a different way to do it. There is a different option. And so I think like for any parents, because it's hard, right? We sit here and we talk about this. This is all hindsight. We're not in the middle of a tantrum right now, right? When emotions are heightened. So for anybody listening, like it's hard, right? And so it's knowing like we're not going to get it right 100% of the time. Like I always tell people, I'm like, you are not a monk. You are a human being. You are a mom who does a lot of things all at once, all the time. Like you're bound to get it wrong. But I love, love, love these conversations because again, it's a little piece of self-awareness. It's a little tool of, I know different. I can choose different now as a parent. So I really appreciate all of your insight today.
That finding of the pause, right? That's something that's
Yeah.
powerful in the yoga practice.
Mm.
Thinking into the postures, pausing, noticing. And if we can get into that habit of pausing and noticing what's going on, listening for that shark music, then we're creating that space. Because in order to make that choice of I'm going to do it differently, you have to find space between the stimulus, tantrum, whatever, and how you respond. If there's no space, you are going to immediately revert back to however you were raised or whatever you're most familiar with. but that pause is really, really powerful.
This is such a powerful conversation too, because that awareness, like a lot of things we don't acknowledge, is just that uniqueness too of the child and their unique tendencies. And when you're present, you can really see, okay, it's not just this is my 8-year-old, my 6-year-old, my 9-year-old, whatever. It is, this person's an artist. They feel a lot. They're really smart. They show up for school. Like, you start to really see them as them. And I think that this exploration and awareness of our pauses and what is happening when we are, I don't know, just having compassion, right? It allows us to really meet the kids as they are. But like I had said earlier too, is because Averie had made me think about this, was our practices are also preventative in a way for us losing that prefrontal control or that
Mhm.
prefrontal dominance when there is hyperarousal. So, like the maintenance of self care and mindfulness for the parent themselves, how that not just models, but it helps us stay coherent when those stressful experiences come online. So it definitely seeps into so many different pieces.
Yes, 100%. That self-care is so, so important.
Yeah, this is awesome. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 at some point and could dive into that world. But this was so helpful. Thank you so much for being here and sharing all this.
Love it. Thank you so much for having me.
It was honestly so great, Gina. Thank you so much.